2,000 years ago, Europe was occupied by a huge variety of peoples: Franks, Normans, Saxons, and a lot of others in between. However, due to their predominantly oral culture, the written information on their way of life is patchy to say the least. We can compensate with archaeological and linguistic evidence, but one of our greatest assets is the work of Roman scholars, who had been butting heads with them for some time. The Romans, generally disinterested in cultural nuance, called these enemy barbarians Germani, which is still in use today for lack of a better term, and I will continue to use here. The Romans' experience with the Germani has given them a reputation for savagery, violence, and primitivism, as they are almost always viewed in a martial and xenophobic context. So what exactly can we learn about them, and how can we account for the bias in the few sources that we have? The answer is complicated, and for it, we're going to get to know a very complicated man. Publius Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman aristocrat, and one of the greatest historians of his time. Despite the wealth of literature on various subjects he left behind, we know very little about his personal life. We know his father-in-law was Agricola, the famous general who conquered and ruled over much of Britain in the 1st century AD, and whom Tacitus wrote a short biography about. Tacitus had a unique fascination with the Germani, considering them to be morally and culturally superior to the Romans, which was a very strange opinion for his time and class. Even in Agricola's biography, he speaks of the native Britons much more favourably than he does of the Roman Empire, admiring their freedom in contrast to the tyranny of his own people. References to the Germani continued throughout his literary career, including his two greatest works, the Annals and the Histories. However, his most detailed account of them comes from a shorter one, now known as Germania. Published in 98 AD, Germania is the first literary work entirely devoted to the Germanic people. Tacitus begins by explaining the lands, culture, and lifestyle of the Germani, before going into detail about the various ethnic groups among them. As he speaks of the environment on mainland Europe, he attributes a lot of the characteristics of the Germani to the conditions they lived in. The country in general, while varying somewhat in character, either bristles with woods or festers with swamps. It is wetter where it faces Gaul, the west, and windier where it faces Noricum and Pannonia, the south. Though fertile in grain crops, it is unkind to fruit trees. It is rich in flocks, but they are for the most part undersized. Even the cattle lack the splendid browse that are their natural glory. It is numbers that please, numbers that constitute their only, their darling, form of wealth. Heaven has denied them gold or silver, shall I say in mercy or in wrath? Reading this now, it gives some indication of the kind of environment that Tacitus himself was used to living in, back in Rome. His mention of the lack of gold and silver also alludes to his political views, particularly on the corruption and greed of the empire, and how he viewed the Germani as free from the burden of money. As you might have guessed, what makes Germania so unique among sources on the Germani, aside from its length and detail, is the positive light Tacitus paints them in. Bearded middle-aged man that he was, he'd grown pretty cynical of the empire's governance, and used Germania to contrast his own leaders' flaws. They choose their kings for their noble birth, their leaders for their valour. Their power even of their kings is not absolute or arbitrary. As for the leaders, it is their example rather than their authority that wins them special admiration. This non-absolute power wielded by the king seems to align with what we know about the structure of Germanic settlements, and the lack of a bureaucratic legal system which would allow totalitarian rule. Another unique feature of Germania is its description of the lives of ordinary Germanic people during peacetime. This kind of information is largely missing from other sources, which only viewed the Germani in terms of war. However, Tacitus does mention their martial practices. Many noble youths, if the land of their birth is stagnating in a protracted peace, deliberately seek out other tribes where some war is afoot. The Germans have no taste for peace. Renown is easier won among perils, and you cannot maintain a large body of companions except by violence and war. Despite his admiration for them, the notion that they are particularly warlike still penetrates his work. This consistency could imply that the trope of their martial culture has more credibility than previously thought from the hyperbole of other writers, or, rather, that Tacitus's information was based on cultural stereotypes common in upper-class Rome, and not first or even second-hand experience. From the way Tacitus writes, it might seem like Germania was intended as anti-empire, pro-Germanic propaganda. However, this was not the case. Tacitus was in favour of the empire's expansion, but he suggests that the empire had strayed from her free and honourable roots, and was being shown up by the Germani, who, if they learned to organise, would become a major threat. The liberty of the Germans is a deadlier foe than the tyranny of the kings of Parthia. He was clearly not one to take them lightly. As bad as Tacitus was at hiding his politics when writing, his ultimate purpose for the text was as it claimed to be, a study of the life and culture of the Germanic people. Despite Tacitus's apparent bias, much of the information in Germania has been verified with archaeological evidence. The biggest problem with his work is not his personal opinion, but the reliability of his sources. Tacitus himself had never actually been to the northern lands he described. Like an American teenager wishing he was Japanese, his information was second-hand at best, likely coming from various travelers and previous writers. Aside from cultural and political details, Tacitus's description extended to the Germanic body type. For myself, I accept the view that the peoples of Germany have never been tainted by intermarriage with other peoples, and stand out as a nation peculiar, pure and unique of its kind. Hence the physical type, if one may generalize at all about so vast a population, is everywhere the same. Wild blue eyes, reddish hair, and huge frames that excel only in violent effort. Interestingly, you can tell he's aware of his own blanket statements, but he still makes them regardless. Compared to a lot of his writings, this reads more like a backhanded compliment than anything, but his mention of a superior race of blue-eyed, pale-skinned people has also presented some pretty obvious problems in recent times. By World War II, Germania had become a foundational text of Nazi ideology, satisfactorily inflating their egos until no 20th century scholar would touch it for decades. This view has faded with time, and few modern Germans find themselves flattered by Tacitus anymore, but Germania will likely remain bound up in this history for some time. Tacitus definitely got some stuff wrong, but the information he provides is still invaluable when used to contextualize the available archaeological evidence. Germania gives a rare account of these people outside of a purely martial, oppositional standpoint, and provides many small details that would otherwise be lost to time. As long as we can account for some level of nuance in the topics he wrote on, and try to verify what we can, Germania remains one of the most valuable resources on a people who are, in many ways, still a mystery.